What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Hi PSI TV. Today I'm going to show you how I'm going to lower the Cadillac, and this is kind of a generic video. This isn't going to work for every car, but this is kind of the wrong way to lower something. So let me get into that a little bit. I put a rather large subwoofer box and amp and battery in the trunk of this car, so the back of it is sitting a little bit lower now. The front of the car is still at stock ride height, so I'll put a picture up here. It looks a little bit funny. I think the front end needs to come down a little bit. So, you know, back in high school, we used to do stupid things like compress the springs in the cars, or heat them up with a torch so that they'll sink, or cut the springs, which is what I'm going to do to this. So the reason that cutting the springs is an issue is, one, it makes the car lower, right? So all your suspension geometry changes. Two, now your shock might not work. And three, when you cut a spring, it changes spring rate. So the car could ride a little bit rougher. Aside from it being lower and the suspension not being set up right, it's going to ride rougher because the spring is actually going to get stiffer when you cut a coil off of it. The reason I'm doing it to the Cadillac is I plan on bagging it this winter, which is, for winter for me, is going to be like January, February, so that's about 3 months away. So I want it to look good while I'm still rolling around right now. So not that big of a deal if it doesn't ride the best. I drive it from here to work. That's about as far as I go with it. So I just want the stance a little bit better. So I'm going to show you today, just quick, we're going to take it apart after we take some measurements to see how much it drops the car. And I'm going to cut a spring and put it back together. All right, so on the Cadillac, we have a round fender opening here. Then you can see we have fender skirts in the back. So of course, the wheel's going to be tucked up inside the quarter panel here. But in the front, I would like the tire up a little bit higher so that there is no fender gap. So what I have right now is 28 7/8 of an inch is what we'll call it. And we'll check the other side just to see if it's about the same. We're a little over 29 inches. So what I need to do is figure out how much spring I want to cut off this thing. First step, of course, is to get it up on the lift, and we'll pull the front wheels off of it and see what kind of suspension we're dealing with. Okay, so got the wheels off the front of the Cadillac, and you can see this is just a regular old like GM B body, G body, A body style suspension. It's called short arm, long arm. Long arm on the bottom, short arm on the top. There's a tie rod end and a sway bar end link and a shock that runs through the center of the spring. So I want to take as little of this apart as possible. So what I think I'll do is I'm going to take the tie rod end off, get the shock out, and then I think all I'm going to do is I'll break the lower ball joint loose, and that's how I'll get the spring out of the car. Should be pretty simple. Alright, so what we're about to do now is loosen the lower ball joint. I'm using a wrench to do this. Now, this is an important step, especially on a suspension setup like this, short arm, long arm. You don't want to take the nut all the way off of the lower ball joint, because that's the only thing that's holding the spring from falling out right now. And I don't mean fall out, I mean fly out, because it's still under compression. So what you want to do is loosen the lower ball joint until the nut is at the top of the threads, and then break the ball joint loose, and then I'll show you how to properly support the lower control arm. Then you take the nut all the way off and drop the spring out. Okay, so you can see, alright, as you can see, I don't have the nut all the way off the ball joint. So what I need to do is break it loose right now, which requires hitting with a hammer. And then we're gonna lower the car down and let the spring out safely. All right, so here's what we got. We have the jack under the lower control arm, and what we wanna do is jack it up until the pressure comes off of our ball joint. All right, just like that. Now we can take the nut off the ball joint and slowly lower the lower control arm down. All right, so we've got the spring out of the car. And here's something that you need to note. You can see that this side of the spring is pretty much flat, and this side has a little bit of a curve to it still. So when you cut this spring, you need to make sure you cut the right side. So this side goes up into the frame, this side sits in the lower control arm. So this is the side that we're gonna cut because the spring doesn't really have a flat spot in it. So when we cut a coil off of it, it'll still sit in the lower control arm correctly. So I'm gonna get this up in the vise and figure out how much we wanna cut off. All right, so here we got the coil spring. Now, deciding how much you're gonna cut off is kind of a play it by ear thing. I don't really know of a calculation to figure out how much to cut off. So originally I was gonna cut off half of a coil. You can see I'd be cutting right here. I don't think that's gonna get me lower or low enough, as low as I want it to be. So I'm gonna cut a full coil off, which means I'm gonna come over to this side and cut. Now, if this makes it too low, I can always take a little bit off the rear to get everything leveled back out, but I don't want to cut not enough and have to do this again. So I'm gonna cut a full coil off this thing. I'm just gonna use a cutoff wheel, and then we'll put it back in the car. All right, so we have our coil cut off. I'll get ready to put this thing back in the car and see what it looks like. Okay, so just like we took the old spring out, we put the new one in with a jack under the lower control arm until we can get the nut started on the ball joint. And now that the spring is installed, we can start putting the rest of the suspension together. All right, now that we have our ball joint tight, don't forget to put a cotter pin back in if this is the kind of vehicle you're working on. Next step is going to be sway bar end link and tie rod end, and that's going to be it. All right, so the last step here is we need to put the shock in place. Once the shock is in, I can get the wheels back on, we'll put it on the ground and see how much lower it is. All right, so we just finished up the Caddy. You can see it's definitely lower. No fender gap anymore. Let's grab the tape measure and check it out. All right, so you can remember before we were almost 29 inches. Now we're at 27 and call it 5/8. So we definitely lowered it more than an inch. We'll roll it outside and see what it looks like. All right, so much better than before. So a real simple process, and the best part is it didn't cost any money. So that's going to do it for this video today, guys. I appreciate you watching. If you have any questions, be sure that you comment below, and don't forget to check out my website. I've got merchandise for sale. There's always a link in the description below, and don't forget to check me out on Instagram as well. Hi PSI TV. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time.